Good evening, everyone. My name is Nevena Spirovska, and it's my pleasure to be your facilitator tonight. On behalf of the Victorian Multicultural Commission, I welcome you back to our Curious Conversation public lecture series. I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners on the land I'm joining you from this evening and pay my deep respects to their elders past and present. I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us this evening. I acknowledge the connections to lands, waters, skies, and the continuing resistance, stories, and songlines, as well as the great diversity amongst First Nations communities. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this was and always will be Aboriginal land. To begin this evening, I'd like to welcome the chairperson of the Victorian Multicultural Commission, Viv Nguyen. Viv is a passionate advocate for genuine community engagement at all levels of decision making. She arrived in this country as a 12-year-old refugee, and for over 25 years, Viv has worked as a business executive as well as a community leader in corporate, community, and government settings. Appointed in her role as chairperson of the VMC just a few months before the COVID pandemic, Viv has fostered a strong avenue for communities to voice their opinions and lived experience to affect government policy directions. Despite the many challenges the pandemic has presented, Viv continues to stay the course of promoting and inspiring Victorians to connect, embrace, and celebrate diversity and differences. Please join me in welcoming Viv Nguyen.
Thank you, Nevena, and good evening for opening the session. I also wish to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands where we meet. I pay my respects to elders past and present and honour the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, their ongoing cultures, languages and traditions. The Victorian Multicultural Commission is a statutory body that connects multicultural communities with government. We work to help people from diverse backgrounds contribute to our state. We advocate for emerging and minority communities to government and help important government messages reach these communities. In all of our curious conversations, we ask our speakers and our audience online, what does multicultural Victoria look like in 2030? This is our sixth session of the series. This time around, we are looking at the future of workplace diversity. This is an important topic that is close to my own heart. It's a space where I've worked in throughout my own career. So I really can't wait to hear from the panelists tonight. It is an absolute pleasure to have MindTribes CEO Div Pillay, Victorian Public Sector Commissioner Adam Fennessy, along with the Secretary of the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing, Sandy Pitcher, who are here to share their thoughts with us tonight. Together, they bring many years of experience in public service and the private sector leadership. In recent times, the public service has set ambitious targets for workplace diversity. Both Adam and Sandy are well placed to speak on some of these challenges encountered in attempting to achieve these targets. And we will also outline the many ways greater workplace diversity is beneficial for all Victorians. Div has also worked collaboratively with the public service for many years, so I'm thrilled that she's able to share her learnings with us. I'm expecting tonight to be an enlightening and compelling discussion. I hope you will all get involved and share with us your questions and ideas in our comment section. Thanks very much, Nevena, and back to you.
Thanks very much, Viv. Your words remind us of the importance of these conversations and celebrating all diversity in our communities. This event is part of our dynamic public lecture series, and we will be discussing what multicultural Victoria looks like now, what it should look like in 2030, and what needs to happen to get us there. Tonight, our panel will focus on workplace diversity. A recent Diversity Council of Australia report argued that most Australian organisations fail to effectively measure the degree and breadth of culturally diverse talent within their leadership teams, workforce, and labour market pool. Diversity data is a powerful tool for understanding the mix of employees in an organisation and can help us make informed decisions about the future direction and aspirations of diversity and inclusion initiatives and overall business strategies. However, of the 300 HR representatives and diversity inclusion practices surveyed for this report, 82% said it was very important to measure workforce diversity, and they reported that, quote, counting culture isn't as easy as there's no widely used standardized approach to defining, measuring, and reporting on workforce cultural diversity in a respectful, accurate, and inclusive way. To explore workforce diversity in the context of multicultural Victoria, we're joined by three expert panelists who will help us explore in further detail why it matters to move beyond measuring and achieving targets. They'll also help us get to the bottom of questions like how can we harness diversity for the benefits of individuals, teams, and organisations? What does this look like in practice? And importantly, how can this be underscored by psychological safety? But before we hear from our panelists, a reminder that we want to hear from you. If you have a question for our panel or panelist, please write it in the Facebook chat and we'll incorporate it into our Q&A. Your voice is important and we'd love for you to be part of this curious conversation. So what does Victoria's multicultural workforce look like in the future? To understand, I'm very pleased to be joined by our three panelists. Div Pillay is an experienced and respected diversity and inclusion practitioner, leader, researcher, and advocate. For over 20 years, her focus has been on race and cultural inclusion. Div leads MindTribes and social enterprise Culturally Diverse Women. Prior to founding MindTribes in 2012, Div held senior human resource leader roles working across Africa, Australia, and Asia. Div's impact is recognised. She is one of 100 women of influence for both the AFR and Qantas in 2018. In 2021, she was named one of 2 Australians in the global list of 25 influential leaders. Div is a current board director at Street, is chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee at the American Chamber of Commerce, and has recently been appointed to the board of Vic Health. Welcome this evening, Div. Adam Fennessy, PSM, is the Victorian Public Sector Commissioner. Adam has over 20 years of public sector experience at state and federal levels, including 4 years as Secretary of the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and prior to that at the Department of Environment and Primary Industries. Adam has worked in the private sector as a partner with advisory firm Ernst & Young. He has also served on several boards, including the Institute of Public Administration Australia, Infrastructure Victoria, Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and Women in Leadership Australia. Adam is an IPAA National Fellow and a member of the Champions of Change Coalition. In 2018, he received a Public Service Medal for leadership in the Victorian Public Service. Adam, thank you for joining us tonight. Rounding us out this evening is Sandy Pitcher, who commenced as Secretary of the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing in February 2021. Before this role, she was the Deputy Secretary of the Higher Education and Skills in the Department of Education and Training from October 2021. Sandy brings public listed company industry experience from her role as an executive consultant in an ASX 100 mining company, Oz Minerals. Prior to this role, Sandy served as the Chief Executive at the Department of Environment, Water and National Research in South Australia and as Deputy Chief Executive at the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Her international government experience includes executive roles at United Kingdom's Commission for Racial Equality. Thanks for joining us tonight, Sandy. It's a pleasure to have you all with us this evening. And Adam, I'd like to start with you to understand, what does multicultural Victoria look like in 2030?
Thanks so much, Nevena. Thanks, Viv. Thank you, everybody, for allowing me to participate in this wonderful Curious Conversation series. For me, when I think about multicultural Victoria in 2030, I think about a vibrant, rich, colourful, diverse and dynamic community that is one of the main reasons why people love living in Melbourne, Victoria and across the state. In my role as Victorian Public Sector Commissioner, I particularly think about the Victorian public sector workforce. Now, that might sound like a bit of a boring start of an answer, but the Victorian public sector workforce is about 9% of the whole Victorian workforce. So we can be a huge agent for change. And data does really matter. You've talked about measurement, Nevena, and so has Viv. At the moment, We've got more people in Victoria in the broader labour force. 32% are born overseas, but only 17% of our public sector employees are. And 26% of the Victorian workforce speaks a language other than English, but only 18% of public sector employees do. So there's a big gap there, and that to me is a very big opportunity. If we can model the change and be the change, because of the size of the public sector workforce, firstly, that can make a huge difference to multicultural Victoria. And secondly, and very importantly, as government, we will provide better services to our communities when we look more like the communities that we serve. So for me, the public sector can be a big part of the change, and we do have work to do, which I think of as an opportunity. And then I think lastly, when we have richer, more diverse and inclusive organisations and communities, but particularly workplaces, they're better places to work. They're more engaged, they're more dynamic, we feel closer to our purpose. So we have a better community, a more effective public sector, and most importantly, we have more engagement and we enjoy what we do for many hours of our day in a vibrant and diverse workplace. So, Nevena, that's my 2030 vision with that particular focus on my role in the Victorian public sector.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for so clearly articulating the vision and the leadership role that the Victorian public service and sector can play. Sandy, I'd love to understand from your perspective, what does multicultural Victoria look like in 2030?
Well, thank you. And it's great to be able to think of a vision of something that's a bit beyond where we are today in this pandemic. So skipping forward to 2030, I think is something that fills me with hope and something that fills me with the excitement of where we can be. Because just as Adam has reflected, thinking about cultural diversity for me is a place of opportunity. And so whether that be the opportunity to move the experience of our current multicultural communities to have more access to all of the things that each Victorian should be able to enjoy: quality education, healthcare, fun and vibrant communities, as Adam said, all of those things that we hold dear, but also that promise of new Victorians and new people who come and enjoy what we're all enjoying together in our state and continuing to contribute to that richness of the fabric of what makes up Victoria. So I love the thought that across, if we project now from 2021 to 2030, we're imagining a world where some Victorians don't even live here yet. Some Victorians that we'll be thinking about in that diverse way are not even born yet. And that sense of us owning that future now and trying to create a strength of future is really important. And like Adam, I think reflecting on the role I'm in now and projecting it forward, one of the things I want to throw in, or one of the concepts, is fairness. So the department that I lead is the Department of Families, Fairness and Housing. It's a pretty unique word to have in a department's name. It's not something that public service has tended to have as a frame. And I think it's a great discussion point for us to delve into. What is a fair society? What is a fair community? What does fairness mean, particularly for those, I think, who have suffered discrimination or have traditionally not had access to things that others have had? So I love the frame of fairness because I think it sends our thoughts to a place that we wouldn't usually be, and where I want us to imagine diversity and fairness in the same frame, where we're not causing any disadvantage to those who suffer multiculturalism, but the opportunity to, I guess, enjoy the best of what multiculturalism is intrinsic to who we are. And I think that that's in the gift of us now. I think that we've got all the settings to make that right now. And I feel like over the next 9 years, it's how do we actually make everyone live and breathe and feel that, and so that it's part of the fabric of who we are, not something that feels like we need to be fighting for. So I think we're in that great part now where we've got a vision, but we're fighting for it. And I really look forward to the to the day where it feels much less of a fight and much more of a celebration.
Thanks, Sandy. I think that hope and vision is something that we're all holding on to in these darker times now, and it's certainly something that we look forward to in the future. And Div, I would love to understand your perspective of what a multicultural Victoria looks like in the future of 2030.
Thanks, Nevena. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am calling in the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects as a migrant to land that was stolen, and really sovereignty has never been gained. So I'm really respectful of that deep cultural root, and I'm very privileged to be a migrant in this country. And I guess from that lens, I love the optimism and hope that Adam and Sandy have. I'm going to come at it from a very pragmatic, solution-based view, because I think the next 9 years is really poignant, because the future that we create in 9 years starts now. And I'd like to think that the vision that we create in 9 years is very much a together, collaborative, co-designed future, because multicultural Victoria really is not responsibility of creating that hopeful, equitable, fair future that is reliant on multicultural Victorians to create. I think that in the spirit of fairness and equity, it needs to be all Victorians that create a very positive future in the next 9 years. And what I'd like to see is that we really have to unpack what is holding us back from creating that positive future. And one of the things I'd like to proposition is that a lot of the work that needs to be done is in the mindsets of people who can start to step up. And the stats that I'm about to reveal really concern and worry me. This comes from the Scanlon Foundation that revealed a social cohesion report at the start of this year. And 84% of Australians felt that multiculturalism was good for Victoria and for Australia as a whole. But the same 84% actually started to, when propositioned on different statements, started to articulate their negative attitudes. And this goes to the heart of why we need to make change together. So, for example, 37% of those respondents held a negative attitude towards Australians, 47% had a negative attitude towards Chinese Australians, and 49% of respondents said they had a very negative or somewhat negative view towards Iraqi and Sudanese Australians. So this concerns me, because if we really want to create that hopeful, positive future in the next 9 years, these are the things that we face up to and reckon with and wrestle with and understand. And what are those negative attitudes? So when it comes to hiring, promoting, advancing into leadership, are we really breaking down those mindsets and creating opportunities and pathways in workplaces? Or are we continuing to write good policy and good workplace programs, but not actually see that diversity really truly represented in the places that it belongs? Because only when we have that workplace inclusion to that level of depth and representation will we see all the other benefits of that diversity come to life, whether it's socioeconomic, cultural, etc. And I really feel passionately about holding up that mirror to ourselves and saying, are we really doing the right things now to be able to enable us to see that positive future in 2030? So apologies for being the pragmatist in sharing some really hard straight up. I hope it's in the good spirit that I intend.
Div, I think you've really touched on something that we wish to explore and going a little bit deeper. So let's hone in on one of those points. Some of those stats that you identified is showing that clearly there is an issue that needs to be addressed. What do you see as being some of the issues that we need to address to move forward? And what do you see as some of the biggest changes?
Some of the issues I would think is that I'll point to Viv's love of data and Adam and Sandy. It really is in understanding the data both at a qualitative level especially because that negative attitude sentiment with agreement of 84% is such a conflicting number. So intellectually, people, when asked, is it good for Australia multiculturalism, and people intellectually say yes, it is, but then actually it doesn't translate into behaviors and action in the workplace or in other environments. So I think the issue to solve for is unpacking both the quantitative representational data in workplaces, but also the qualitative lived experiences. And one of the things that, today is Equal Pay Day in Australia. And, you'll see social media everywhere is quoting 14.2% of a gender pay gap. But my question is, if you disaggregate that gender data for migrant women from a non-English speaking background, women who are those, but also suffer from a disability, etc., you just start to see that number get larger in terms of ethnic pay gap. And our data at MindTribes show, when we investigate both private and public workforces, we can see that number jump to around 33 to 36%, which is very alarming. And that's financial equity right there. And health, access to health, education, all of those things are at risk. So what I'd say is that the solution lies in really understanding both the qualitative and quantitative data, and not fooling ourselves when we look at the quantitative data that we've got some representation. And this happened in the gender equality movement back. We reached the target of 50 balanced teams, and we said, okay, we're here. And I don't want to think that that's job is done. There's a lot more to do. And when you have the qualitative lived experiences of multicultural women or multicultural men or multi people from different age demographics, you start to see a very different problem to solve. And I want the curiosity and the bravado and courage of leaders to say, I want to know what that lived experience is. And from there, you can kind of co-design what needs to happen next in terms of building that 2030 future. But that solution lies in unpacking that. And I think there's not enough courage to look there. I think we're kind of getting comfortable with some achievements like balance on boards or balance at executive teams.
And thank you for bringing that intersectional lens to this conversation. And I think it would be amiss of us not to include that when we do have these, when we examine both these problems and the solutions. Adam, from your perspective of the public sector workforce, how can we address some of these concerns? And are there any initiatives that you've seen that you feel are taking us on the path forward to 2030?
Yeah, so thanks, Nevena. This is so critical, and it builds on what Div just said about how do we get a better understanding of where we're at, if you like, unpack the data, and how do we understand the lived experience. And I was at a diversity forum a number of months ago, and the guest speaker was Julia Gillard, and I'm going to, I won't get it right, but to paraphrase her, we have to be stubbornly persistent and relentlessly impatient. So what I learned from that is we've got to keep going at it, keep learning, keep trying different things, and not wait for these pipelines or for the data to eventually move. So in my experience in government, there's lots of things you can do and you need to do, and you've got to keep going at it. And to give you an example, so at the Commission, every year we do a very deep dive survey of the whole public sector. And I mentioned before it's big. So we have 320,000 public sector employees. And when we do this annual survey, we get around 100,000 responses. So it's very rich data. But to go back to Div's point, what does that tell us and how do we use that data? So for this year's survey, we worked closely with Viv, and we also worked with the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission to ask better questions about cultural diversity, because if you don't ask the right question, you're not going to start with the right data. And I've learned this from Viv, that we've got to get the right baselines and we've got to keep improving our data. So for the first time in 2020 and this year as well, public sector employees were asked about their cultural identity. So that's a good start and a better start to understand what that looks like in Victorian government. But even then, to unpack that, what we found was 79% identified as Australian, And after those who selected Australian as their cultural identity, the next highest response was 8% of people who said prefer not to say. So we've tried to collect data differently, and we know we're still not getting there. So we've got to keep working relentlessly to improve that data, but also work out other ways of unpacking it, as Div was saying. So to unpack that, we were also asking if respondents could choose more than one cultural identity, what would the other be? And 10% of respondents who chose Australian also identified another group, and of that, 50% was European, 48% British Irish, 33% East or South Asian respondents. So we were starting to unpack that, and to me, we've got to keep learning. And I know working with Div as well as Viv, we're learning better ways to ask, to survey, and to collect data. Data is very powerful if you get it in the right way and you use it for the right measures. So that's my first answer. And off the back of this year's data, I'm excited to see those results. And I'm excited as well to work with Viv and Div to keep doing that better year on year. My second example is to get right into the lived experience. I've been working very closely with the Victorian Public Sector Women of Colour Network. Div's done some amazing work with them. And the first thing we wanted to do to understand the lived experience of women of colour working in the public sector was to do some really good survey work. Again, get the data. We went to MindTribes and Div Pillay because, Div, you are a very good expert at this, and I'm not, and we want to learn as an organisation. So we did that. The results were very sobering and gave us much more of that lived experience. And not only was the data important, when we launched the report internally within government, the first part of the launch wasn't a snapshot of the data. It was actually a poetic reflection from, I think, 5 or 6 women of colour, just to share their experience of what it's like being a woman of colour in Victorian government. So we're using different ways to understand the lived experience and use the data and use that data to inform better programs. So for better programs, for example, from surveying Women of Colour Network, one of the top things that came through the data was doing more early to mid-career leadership programs. Now, we deliver a lot of leadership programs, so we can then better design that for different cohorts across the public sector, including women of colour, and indeed lots of other diversity cohorts, because a diverse public sector is a high-performing public sector and a better place to work. And then my second learning out of that was a much more specific set of actions that came out of that work that then come into a broader whole of Victorian government diversity and inclusion strategy. So there's a lot of examples, and I could go on further, but I won't. But to unpack that, it goes to what Div says. Before you unpack the data, how do you collect the right data and get that important baseline? Secondly, what's the lived experience and what are the programs you design to address that? And then how do you relentlessly monitor, track and evaluate and keep coming back? So that's an example of what we're doing right now across Victorian government, including with experts like Div and Viv.
Thank you, Adam. And I think that holistic approach goes to show that people can feel that psychological safety if their entire lived experience is being heard and incorporated into future workforce planning and policies. So thank you for sharing that. And Sandy, from your perspective at the department, what do you think has worked well in the past and what can we do to keep improving for the future?
Oh, well, look, there's so many things that I think we need to consider as we're looking to improve in the future. And many of them are not things that have worked in the past. So I think there's lessons to be learned about what hasn't worked as well as what has. I think some of the traps that I've seen that can be fallen into that I want to remind us not to go there again is that often we see where disadvantage has occurred and we try and change the people, the groups who have suffered that disadvantage rather than change the attitudes and behaviours of those in the majority or the structures we have. Seen that time and time again in many different areas, and I would like to sort of call out one of the places I think we really see this happening in many areas is that we rely on Aboriginal staff in many and Aboriginal friends in many places to be the ones who champion reconciliation rather than reconciliation being something that everyone plays a part in, but perhaps those who are not suffering other multiple disadvantages to take more of the cultural load than they do. And so I see that again. So I want us to unlearn that behaviour and learn a different behaviour. And I think viewers, you have stumbled on a group of data activists, if not data nerds, in this group. And one of the sets of data that I love looking at is taking some of the things that Dev's highlighted, the work that people have done and continue to do about how do you change those attitudes once you've got them. So once you've got understanding where people's sense of discrimination but also attitudinal support sits, how do you keep changing the curve of what that means? And for me, it's a dual time of incrementalism, which can make its way and is really important, but actual structural change, really big change in the way we do things, is actually where I think is how we need to make a bigger difference. So the damage, I suppose, of incrementalism can be that it sits on the shoulders of the individual. The first Asian woman to do X, the first person to do Y. And that actually isn't about changing the structures or breaking down the barriers. It's really important you can't be what you can't see, but actually it's not going to be the part that really makes the change so that in 2030 these things are really revolutionised. So I am really interested in understanding that. And, one of the things about a workplace is you can change every individual within a workplace, but if you haven't changed the structures that built it the way it is, that change will not be felt by those who should be experiencing it. So I think digital access and literacy are ways you do that. I think access to education, access to other skills. And I will just throw one final thought into this mix that we can dwell on. When I was talking earlier about fairness, we don't all start from the same starting point, even in accessing some of the basic rights in Australia, and that's structural inequality. And it's also, and I think particularly in the realm of multiculturalism, the status about which an individual can access some of these things. So if you are in Australia on a certain type of visa, the ability for you to even participate in education or have financial security is really limited. And we saw even just this disadvantage in COVID with a whole lot of students who'd come from overseas to study in Australia, one of our leading industries, one that we're so proud of. But those international students, when COVID came, found themselves in a financial hardship that was really troubling for individuals, and really as a cohort showed a structural inequality that I think we had been otherwise a bit blind to. So there's a lot of lessons, I think, to learn about those fundamental things that we have as structures about being able to access things that are really important to people's lived experience.
Thank you for taking that all of systems approach to that answer, Sandy. And as we move on, we're coming to the Q&A portion of our event. If you have posted in our chat, and we have a lot of questions coming through, thank you very much. We'll try to get through as many as possible. If you have a curious burning question for our panelists, please include it and we'll aim to get to it. This one has come through in our chat and really just gets to the heart of the conversation that we're having here. Adam, why is it important in all the work that you do to have a diverse workforce?
So I think what I have learned from both lived experience and data and evidence, from lived experience, when I've worked in more diverse workforces, they're better places to work. You get a range and a plurality of views, you get different perspectives, but you also have to develop different capabilities to learn how to listen differently, to have that cultural safety. So it's not just, you can't just take for granted that if you have more diversity in your workforce, you're going to get the benefits of that. The other thing in the public service, we love evidence. We love to be evidence-based because we're spending your money as taxpayers. Research internationally and locally tell us time and time again that more culturally diverse organisations are higher performing. So one factoid that I dug out, in fact, I did some research for 2 weeks ago. We launched the VPS African Australian Network, and I wanted to talk about what the evidence tells us. So some of those facts: organisations with inclusive cultures are 3 times more likely to be high performing. 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile, and 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. So in a sense, that makes sense intellectually and rationally, but as Div has reminded us, how do we move from the acknowledgement of that to the lived experience? When I was in a previous organisation in Victorian government, we very much disrupted the whole organisation. It became a lot more diverse, and I found I was arguing less with people in the organisation because we were more able to have a debate. And my lived experience was I really enjoyed going to that organisation. We also measured and we commissioned a study on the commercial benefits of a diverse, inclusive structure. And we found we saved money because we had higher employment engagement, more people wanted to work for us, and more people stayed around. So both the evidence told us that we were higher performing. Ultimately, we were doing better for communities across Victoria. We were a less argumentative and more enjoyable workplace. That was my lived experience. And I met a lot of really interesting people and I really enjoyed it. So to me, it's about bringing together the evidence and the data, and there's a lot out there, but some of that data has been out there for a long time, and how do you reap those benefits? Now, one comment I'll add to what Sandy just said, one of the opportunities coming out of the very difficult times we've had through COVID is COVID has been incredibly disruptive. So what we're seeing now in Victorian government, because large parts of our workforce have worked remotely, worked digitally, and it goes to Sandy's point about digital access and literacy, it's shaken up a lot of our systems, and a lot of systems that were not very diverse and systems that had embedded biases. So when I was responsible for creating a more diverse organisation myself, we did it through disruption and things like targets, because targets have lots of pros and cons. Targets can disrupt, and I know Vivian and I talk about that a lot. COVID, whether we wanted to or not, has disrupted us enormously. And in some cases, we are so much closer to our communities, whether we wanted to or not. So what are the benefits that disruption brings us? So that was both my lived experience. I enjoyed working in diverse organisations. The literature tells us that's the case. And we're currently tracking to see some of those benefits from when we were in lockdown, how we did deliver services for Victorians. So it's always a constant juggle between getting the evidence, working on what it's like from a humanistic perspective, and we've got to be relentless in both of those approaches while continuing to listen to the life experiences and stories of people in our organisations.
Thank you, Adam. That sounds like a very solid business case for a diverse and positive workforce. Div, this question has come in through you, and we know that MindTribes has been researching different models of best practice for diversity and inclusion abroad. Can you share some of the learnings with us and talk us through why we shouldn't be setting targets for target's sake?
Very good question. Sounds like someone I probably recently interviewed for some of our research, I think. So yes, we have been scouring locally and globally. And to answer this question, what we have derived is that there's a good framework of actually tackling some of these issues that we've been discussing, and it falls into two frames. One is an approach. So really organizations and leaders and people understanding what is your approach solving for inequity. And there's definitely some good case studies even here in Australia. So there's the WorkSafe approach where we are looking at harm and saying the inclusion of psychological harm is in that model, but that model is very much, when harm occurs, that there is a consequence of that harm, and the employer and the employee need to tackle that. But it is in a lag effect, so it's happened already, right? So there's no proactive kind of movement there. Then there's the approach of, WGEA, so the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, and that shows us a very incentivized approach. So it says, when you hit your targets and when you reach your milestones, we reward and recognize and we publish publicly who has done well in reaching those targets. But the approach that we found that actually both of those and actually is game changing actually comes from Victoria. So I'm very proud of that to say that we scoured the approaches and we found that the Commission for Gender Equality in the Public Sector and the appointment of Dr. Nikki Vincent as commissioner really has both of those elements. It asks organizations to do the data audit, both qualitative and quantitative. It asks for an impact assessment from a service perspective. Are we inclusive of the communities that we serve, and do we need to change anything in our service delivery? It asks for an action plan that is measured and reported on, and there is actually some consequence of not achieving what you plan to achieve. So my big call to action is for potentially someone like Vivian in her role as VMC to be given some of that powers and legitimacy to really do a similar model of the gender equality in the public sector with the Act, so have a formal Act, because our multiple Act in Victoria doesn't offer that change making sort of road mapping and then measurement and accountability checking. So that's the model. Some of the other interesting models goes to the second frame. So I talked about the approach, and the second frame is the mechanism. So a lot of the literature out of Sweden, out of Canada, the UK, even Japan and Singapore really looks at putting in place a mechanism that operationalizes workplace inclusion and equity. And some of the main concepts there and case studies that were really good was mainstreaming, from the concept of mainstreaming from Sweden, really making the work very much normalized. So making gender equality, for example, or racial inclusion, and not a separate piece of work that's tackled in a very siloed project basis, but something that happens every day, all day, in every piece of work that everyone does. So mainstreaming and normalizing, it was a big takeout from there. Actually really accelerating change and transformational change came from my home country, South Africa, and a lot can be critiqued with South Africa, but post-apartheid affirmative action with targets was a transformational effort. So for example, when I was a young professional, we had to support white leaders to career develop and support a Black leader in a 24-month cycle. And that was an affirmative action appointment at the end of the 24-month cycle. And the white leader actually had to find an exit strategy in 2 years. So they had to find another role in the organization, or they had to consider other career transitions that they could make. But it was a real game changer. It was public, it was visual, it was planned, it was capacity and capability building, so that no one could say that this Black leader was tokenistically and there was no merit around that appointment. This person was confident and comfortable to take on that role. And that was, there was a lot of execution issues with that, affirmative action and targets, but it allowed us to see a model of what could work. And I absolutely would love to see those sorts of models taken up, because it's got all of those ingredients from the gender equality in the public sector model, the roadmap change. So I'd say there's a lot of good that can be, operationalized quickly. It is about choice and decision making with leaders who are currently in power and lead teams to really look at where is that best practice and how can you start to pilot and trial and put in action. I think a lot of what I see in government and the private sector is the hesitancy to act because they want some sort of blueprint that is already, almost overly engineered to the point where they never start and they never do anything, waiting for a perfect solution. So I'd say gather what you can, and we'll be putting out a report in another month that really articulates all of these case studies and best practice and the framework. But there's a lot to be said for just moving, and just do it, to start. Best advice.
And that's such an important takeaway that I'd like to underscore there, Div. It's embedding those theories of change into our daily life and also normalizing change in our workforce in a proactive manner, perhaps a challenge or an opportunity for people to take away tonight. Sandy, we've had both a comment question, the favourite type, come in for yourself, and it reads, my experience of working with multicultural community groups and seeing the representation in the public service is that I feel that there is a long way to go to achieve actual representation of the diversity in the public service. Will this be a starting point to include diversity in senior bureaucracy? What is your vision on this?
Well, I think the comment from that person that it feels like that, I think we know the data says it is like that. It is. It is a place where we really need to make much bigger change. So the observation is correct and the vision is to change. I go back to my earlier sort of reflection about needing a big bang rather than an incremental change, because I suspect if we continue at the pace of change now, I don't know the number or the year, but it will be many, many decades before we'll achieve a proper representation of our community if we continue at the pace we're in. So we need a circuit breaker and a change. And I think I could not agree more with the don't wait till you've got a perfect plan to put it into place, because we suffer from that already, I think, across the community. What I would say, and this goes a little bit to the earlier point too, is that when I worked in the UK, I worked at an organisation called the Commission for Racial Equality, and what we were doing there, I think, is again a bit of a lesson for what we're talking about here, which is how do you call out what the problem is, provide active solutions, and then be relentless about making the solutions get put into place. There's a recognition, an action, and an accountability step that the public service will need to go on, and I think we're part of the way there. But there is a need to recognise that when you change the makeup and diversity of a workplace, it can't just be with all the same structures that we have now. So I think we need to think really differently about what it is that we want to see and why we want to see it reflected in our executive ranks, in our senior leadership, in all of the jobs we do. And so it's valuing connection to community, it's valuing diversity of experience, not necessarily years served in a certain area of role, or not necessarily a certain type of degree or a certain type of part. So it is really discomfort. Like if we don't feel some discomfort or make things a bit uncomfortable about what we're changing, then we probably aren't really challenging ourselves enough. So for me, that would be the place we need to spend some energy and effort. And all the way back to right now in 2021, across the public service, particularly in my agency, we have been hiring people to work directly on the COVID effort who speak languages other than English, and asking them to connect with their communities to help the relief efforts, to help testing, to help other parts. It's not a bonus that someone has a language, oh, wouldn't that be handy? It's no, what is the function we need and why do we need it? Where is the urgency and how do we better serve our community? And if you're asking that really challenging question, how do you better serve the community? It's by having that reflection and connection, living, working and being part of the effort you're doing. So that's where I want to see the challenge.
Thank you so much. And thank you for naming that discomfort, Sandy. I think that's really important for us to do in having these conversations. Adam, perhaps you won't be surprised by the fact that we have a lot of questions about recruitment. So one that's come through to you is, how can we make recruitment more inclusive? At our workplace, we have issues on key selection criteria. What have you found work outside of anonymising applications?
So there's been a lot of really good work here, and it's an example of some of the structural biases or disadvantages that are hard-baked into how we work in the current systems. There's been some really good work in Victorian government about neutralising language and completely changing the way we write things like selection criteria. Even selection criteria itself, in the past when I've had to apply for jobs, it's just mind-numbing to have to go through all of these selection criteria. So how do we bring a fresh approach to that? And that's really hard. I know that the Department of Premier and Cabinet did some very good blind recruitment processes and changed the way we structured up the recruitment process. I also saw Vic Health getting involved in technology developments to filter and use technology to change the way we describe things. We put together the recruitment processes themselves. And in my own experience, there's a whole industry of senior executive search firms out there. And when we were working in a different diversity space, which was gender diversity, we found that the executive recruitment firms were part of the problem, to be frank. They would bring shortlists that they used to bring to other departments, and I used to insist on getting gender balanced shortlists, and some firms couldn't do that. And I think that was because they just hadn't adapted and hadn't thought differently. So what does that approach look like for cultural diversity? Because we've made some improvements in gender diversity. There is still a long way to go. What can we learn from those different areas and that intersectionality? And this is where Dr. Nikki Vincent is doing a lot of her work in terms of intersectionality to come out of gender equality and to work into broader cultural diversity. So I found that to be very important, to be disruptive of every part of the system. The other thing, I really support the comments that have been made by the panel that you've got to disrupt at every level. So we've got a fantastic new program, which is really important right at the start at the intern level. So we've just launched a refugee and asylum seeker intern program. Now that's really important because it's bringing people in directly and bypassing some of the regulatory blockers to having your skills and your qualifications recognised and getting you straight in to Victorian government. We've just launched that with career seekers and it's got some great early take-up. But to me, that is just one small part of a very broad system. I said before that I've learned not to trust pipelines. If we've got a good intake with interns and graduates, the pipeline tails off, and we've seen that very persistently. So how do we disrupt at every level, including in particular at the top? And I really love Div's example of that experience in South Africa, that affirmative action combined with targets. How do we support, sponsor, and bring people into more senior positions rather than just say, you'll get there on merit, apply for more jobs? We know that doesn't work. That's where targets can be disruptive because it forces organisations to think differently, but targets are not the be-all and end-all and sometimes can actually be counterproductive. So I really like that idea of sponsoring, mentoring and the affirmative action approach. We do have special measures affirmative action opportunities in Victoria under equal opportunity legislation, and the Commission has used those in particular for within our Aboriginal employment strategy because we need to do things differently. And what we're finding is we are learning, in fact, the program we used for interns was called Career Trackers. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interns, the same private company offered career seekers for refugees and asylum seekers. So even though they're not the same issue, we can learn from different approaches, things that worked well here. Can we try that there? A common theme, for example, is cultural safety when a person is coming into a workplace across the Victorian Public Service. So there's a few examples of what we're doing, but to me it goes to that theme that Sandy encapsulated so well of we've got to be persistent and impatient, and we've got to keep going. Policy is not a perfect science, and it's not just about having good policy, and I think Div Pillay said this, it's about making things happen. Don't wait till you've got a perfect plan. Public servants are generally risk averse, and it can feel scary just to try something knowing that it might not work. But when you have a go, you often get so many great unintended consequences. You learn from the things that don't work as perfectly. There'll be other things that work really well that you would never have known had you not tried. So to me, you've got to get out there and have a go and bring that confidence with you, and from a leadership perspective, but also a humility, knowing that it might not work, but we'll have a go anyway. That's what we did with career seekers. We thought, what a great idea, let's just have a go, and bang, we put it out there and got enormous response. Now we have to be patient and work out what's going to be the lived journey of refugee and asylum seekers coming into that program, because we've only just initiated that. How do we learn from that? What's going to work? What won't work? And, you know, this is that learning mindset that I think is so important in the public sector.
Thank you, Adam. And Div, that feeds into the next question that we have, which is what do you see as some of the challenges that workforces may face in creating more diverse workforces?
I think the challenges are going to be back to my earlier point about mindset. I think the challenges are that leaders come to this work in a holistic fashion where they doing initial programs and they stop start, and a lot of what we've seen in the private and public sector is 10 years ago when I started on this journey, we could not get ahead of diversity inclusion or a chief people officer to really take cultural diversity seriously. The comments that we got were cultural diversity is not a pillar. We're working at gender equality first. And saying that to a culturally diverse woman just has a double whammy there, because I go, okay, so women like me are not part of your gender equality work. You're going to wait to solve that, I don't know, in 200 years, and then you'll get to me. So I think the challenge that you're going to find is that the prioritization of cultural diversity and really looking at it from an equity lens is really going to be the challenge, because there's a real difference between equality and equity. We all don't have the same access. We've been talking about that level of fairness. All come start from different starting blocks, and that's the challenge. The key challenge is the mindset shift and the prioritization by leaders, because it's too much of, over the last 10 years, it's just been stop, start, and we really haven't got systemic change. The other challenge, I think, is going to be facing in fact that 1 in 5 Australians experience racial discrimination, and that's a sobering fact. And that racial discrimination actually has now a quantification around what it means to our economy. There was a recent study done by Deakin University. It costs us 3.6% of our GDP every year. That is $44.9 billion to the Australian economy. And how that's calculated is the impact to mental health and the strain that it has on an individual, and then the reliance on the services to support them, but also the fact that when you have someone who's experiencing racial discrimination, they are not their best selves at work. They are covering, they are feeling invisible, they are in protection mode. So all of the wonderful things that Adam quoted about the benefit of diversity in the workforce, the social benefit, the economic benefit, the business benefit, innovation, high levels of engagement, productivity, those things will never be realized if we don't tackle in the same relation as you talk about the benefits of multiculturalism. We talk about what is the impact of racial discrimination that is happening in our workplace, and do we know that it exists, and are we creating enough voice around even saying that this occurs in our workplaces? That's our challenge, facing into that and understanding the outcomes implications of building a better future, with also recognizing the equity and change making that needs to happen behind the scenes for that. And unless we do that, we will never move forward positively into that 2030 positive future. Feels a bit doom and gloom.
Not at all. A very sharp point there, and a very important one to be made. As we slowly creep to the end of our time, I would love to get the panel's final thoughts on everything that you've heard tonight and share with our audience a call to action that you have. Sandy, what are your final thoughts on workforce diversity and our vision for 2030?
Well, I would say that boldness and strength and action are all really important. And I guess one of the frames I would say as well of what we've been talking about today is workforce is the place where some of us have responsibilities, we can measure it, we can count it. But the workforce is only one part of the equation for everyone's lived experience, the way they exist in our community and our society. So to make Victoria the place we want to be in 2030, it's about thinking about the workforce and beyond and calling to account all of those ways that we can do that, but never underestimate the need to change hearts and minds in a really broad sense. And I think that is the role of public servants, and I think it's the role of leaders in lots of different leadership roles that we all play, whether it's our paid leadership roles or those we play in community, friends, and other parts of our existence. So my call to arms is that people aren't alone, and there's a lot of different ways to change the trajectory, but that we need to really be united and really clear about some of the really hard things that have to be looked at and faced, because the outcomes that we'll achieve will be so worth it.
Thank you, Sandy. And Adam, what is your one sentence or less or more perhaps to our audience? What's the takeaway that you'd like them to have tonight?
Well, to me, it's supporting change through everyday action and system change. It's got to be both, and keep a very close eye on the lived experience. I've got a lot out of connecting indirectly with our Women of Colour network, and they hold me to account and say, well, what are you going to do next? So when you're feeling uncomfortable about change, you're in the right space, and keep it very personal, keep in touch with the stories as well as the system change, the data, and make sure we see a long-term shift.
Brilliant. Thank you, Adam. And Div, you've provided a great case tonight about why we should perhaps be moving towards the equity state, not just the equality state. But what's your final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience this evening?
Thanks, Nevena. I'll draw down on Adam's commentary about lived experience data and just a call to action for leaders and others on this in this audience is that don't only look at gathering lived experience data once or twice. So in people matter surveys or engagement surveys or in small focus groups when you're trying to discover what to do next, you should have a continuous way of gathering voice and actually developing the deep listening skills that everyone needs to have. But because a lot of what I see is that the lived experience data, someone looks at it and analyzes it, they only pull certain themes, which then are crafted into programs and initiatives, and that actually carry inherent bias in it anyway, the way that you look at the data. So my call is find a way of creating an agency with people talking a lot of the time, all of the time, and upward feedback very normalized in your organization. A place to look is #NotMe, so the audience can have a look at that. It's working really well in the Europe and US market, creating a continuous voice for employees to talk. And the other lesson that I'd share is from Indigenous culture and that self-determination, that you need a human-centric design. If you're going to design anything with cultural diversity, you need to include the people who represent that diversity in the design of the program itself. And to Adam's point, holding you accountable when it's not working well. So if we can't change lived experience of equity and inclusion, representation doesn't always matter. It's about that experience of inclusion. So that's my call to action. Be really steadfast in going after that, those two things.
Sincere thanks to our panel tonight, Adam, Div, Sandy, to the Victorian Multicultural Commission and to the Victorian Multicultural Commission Chairperson, Viv Nguyen, as well as every person who tuned in tonight and posed a question or perhaps a challenge to our panellist. I hope this conversation has provided everyone with the opportunity to understand the social and economic benefits and case for workforce diversity. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Curious Conversation public lecture series. Good night.